Imagine walking into a place that feels like it exists outside the bounds of time and law, a place hidden not just in geography, but in the shadows of a nation's collective pain. That's Aynaghar, the infamous network of secret detention centers in Bangladesh. Recently, the chief advisor of the interim government did something no one in power had done before. They stepped into Aynaghar itself, facing a dark, deeply uncomfortable truth. The revelations from this visit were both horrifying and necessary. These centers, buried in secrecy, have operated in places like Aynaghar and Uttara for decades. Cells so small, so suffocating, that detainees described them as animal cages. Former prisoners shared accounts of relentless interrogations designed to strip them of their will, days, even months, of isolation and sensory deprivation. Can you imagine, really, what that does to a person? Physically, mentally, spiritually? The aim was clear: to silence anyone who dared to raise their voice. And the instruments of this repression, the state's own machinery, weaponized against its people. Under Sheikh Hasina's leadership, allegations have mounted that agencies like the DGFI, the National Intelligence Agency, were actively detaining dissenters on trumped-up charges. No due process, no oversight, just a calculated effort to maintain control by crushing opposition. It's chilling to think how normalized such practices became, how they eroded any expectation of basic human rights for so many. One story that stuck with me came from a journalist now living in exile. She described how she once spoke out against corruption in Bangladesh and received anonymous warnings to stop. When she didn't, her colleagues began disappearing one by one. She fled the country. She told me she hasn't been back in over 10 years because the fear of arbitrary detention still looms large. And she's not alone. So many activists and thinkers have been scattered across the globe, not because they wanted to leave, but because they had to. It's tragic, isn't it? For these individuals, the choice has always been stark: risk everything or lose your voice entirely. And for those who stayed, who resisted, who were dragged into Aynaghar, the system itself ensured their silence in the most brutal ways. The chief advisor's visit to Aynaghar has forced a national reckoning that was long overdue. But as we'll see in the next chapter, this is not just about secret prisons. It's about how entire state institutions were transformed into tools of political control, a system that, well, let's just say, it's far more insidious than these detention centers alone. When examining how a system of repression like this comes into being, it's impossible to ignore the role of state institutions. Under Sheikh Hasina's regime, these institutions weren't just passive enforcers, they were weaponized. Agencies like the National Intelligence Agency and the Directorate General of Forces Intelligence weren't there to serve the people, but to control them, to ensure dissent was a risk few dared to take. But how does that happen? How do institutions meant to protect citizens end up working against them? One glaring reason is the absence of any real oversight. These agencies have operated with impunity, free from scrutiny or accountability. There's no independent body to investigate abuses, no transparent checks. This allowed an environment of fear to take root, where critics and opponents were silenced without consequence. Think about it. A journalist penned a critical article, detained. An activist spoke at a rally, silenced. Even academics, university professors discussing political theory faced threats if their ideas veered too far off the script, and no one felt safe. You kinda start to wonder, doesn't this erode not just trust in government, but trust in each other? The entire fabric of a nation starts to fray when fear becomes the dominant currency. There's a cultural impact too. Stories aren't just lived experiences, they shape who we are as a people. Think of films like The Lives of Others, or even The Shawshank Redemption. They show what oppression does, how resilience can emerge even in the darkest moments. And in Bangladesh, we've seen our activists, our writers, our unsung heroes step into that role. They've used their voices, often at great personal cost, to demand accountability for these abuses. One activist once told me You can survive almost anything if someone knows you're suffering. That's what drives them, making sure these stories, these truths are heard, and that's the crux of it. Without civic engagement, without collective action, systems of control thrive. They thrive on silence, on apathy, on the belief that nothing can change. But what happens when voices cut through that silence? When international organizations start to take notice? We'll get into that in the next chapter as we look at how global watchdogs have documented these abuses and pressed for transparency. It's, well, a complex interaction between local struggles and the global push for accountability. International pressure, I think, has always played a complicated role in a country's internal affairs. In Bangladesh's case, it's been essential for shining a light on the darkest corners of the state's machinery. Organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have, for years, documented human rights abuses linked to these detention centers. They've published reports, held press conferences, and honestly just refused to let the world look away. What's interesting, though, is how this kind of advocacy creates ripples. Governments, especially those reliant on international trade or aid, can't afford to ignore the scrutiny entirely. Bangladesh, for instance, has faced diplomatic pressure to clean up its human rights record. Some countries have even imposed sanctions targeting individuals or agencies accused of serious abuses. And when global watchdogs step in, it's not just about reporting, it's about nudging international allies to demand reforms, to make human rights a condition for cooperation. Take, for example, the Magnitsky sanctions. We've seen how these sorts of measures can hold powerful figures accountable in ways that domestic systems often won't, or, just can't. By naming names and freezing assets, these sanctions signal that no one is completely untouchable, and while they won't undo the harm, they're pivotal in setting a precedent, a warning, really, that abuses come with consequences. But here's the thing, external advocacy can't work in isolation. It needs a symbiotic relationship with domestic reform efforts. When international groups amplify voices on the ground, from activists to survivors, they offer critical protection. It's a way to ensure that these brave individuals don't stand alone, that their stories reach beyond borders, adding layers of pressure for change. So it's, not just intervention, but a collaboration of sorts. And yet, there are risks too, aren't there? Foreign pressure can sometimes be perceived as overreach, even as an attack on sovereignty. I mean, let's face it, authoritarian regimes often lean on exactly that narrative to discredit critics. They frame them as agents of foreign agendas, undermining movements that are, at their core, deeply local. It's a fine line, balancing international advocacy without overshadowing domestic struggles. Still, it's undeniable that global attention has brought issues like Aynaghar into sharper focus. These efforts help to bolster the voices that might otherwise have been drowned out completely. And as we look at the next piece of this puzzle, the role of independent media and investigative journalism in exposing these truths, we'll see just how powerful storytelling can be in the fight for accountability. Media, especially investigative journalism, has a unique power. It can illuminate truths that regimes would rather keep concealed. And in Bangladesh, where Aynaghar operated in shrouded secrecy for decades, it was often the press that shed the first light. You look back and see how journalists, even at tremendous personal risk, documented the stories of ex-detainees, of families searching for loved ones who vanished overnight. One particular investigative piece comes to mind. It detailed the physical and psychological toll of Aynaghar through testimony from survivors. These reports painted a harrowing picture: prisoners subjected to inhumane conditions, relentless interrogation techniques meant to break them. The journalists behind these stories weren't just writing articles, they were building an archive of resistance, a way to ensure history couldn't simply be erased. But it's not easy, is it? Media in Bangladesh often operates under immense pressure. Laws like the Digital Security Act have been wielded against critical voices, effectively criminalizing dissent under the guise of maintaining order. Journalists reporting on sensitive issues, whether it's corruption, human rights abuses, or secret detention centers, face legal threats, intimidation, sometimes even arrests. It's a constant uphill battle, fighting for transparency in a system that thrives on opacity. And yet, the press persists. One example that stands out is a documentary that pieced together first-hand accounts from families of detainees. It was banned almost immediately in Bangladesh, but went on to receive international attention. That kind of storytelling, it forces accountability, doesn't it? It makes it harder for systems of repression to operate unchecked because the public begins to see the humanity in these stories, the survivors, the families left behind. They can't be ignored. There's collaboration too. International media often acts as an amplifier, taking local stories to a global stage. It's a partnership. Bangladeshi reporters provide the context, the nuance, while international outlets give these stories the reach they might not otherwise have. You think about how The Guardian reported on Aynaghar based on domestic investigations. That interplay, it makes a difference. It reframes local issues as global concerns, creating pressure points for change. But here's the thing. Media doesn't just document history, it shapes it. By exposing these injustices, it demands better, forces societies to confront uncomfortable truths. And what comes next is crucial. Truth commissions, systemic reform. That's where structural change begins, and we'll delve into that next. When a society has to confront shadows as dark as Aynaghar, the real work begins in understanding how to move forward. The chief advisor's visit has sparked a national reckoning, sure, but acknowledging the problem is the first step. It's not the solution. The path forward requires more than outrage. It demands action, and that action begins with reform. One of the ideas gaining momentum right now is the establishment of truth commissions. These would serve as platforms for survivors to come forward, for their stories to be heard, documented, and most importantly, believed. It's about more than just recording history. It's about healing, about honoring pain with accountability. Imagine what it would mean for someone, after years of silence, to finally feel seen and to know their suffering wasn't for nothing. But even as we embrace truth commissions, we have to consider the broader picture, systemic issues that allowed such abuses to take root in the first place. There's a pressing need for reforms that ensure transparency. Agencies like the National Intelligence Agency need oversight. Without independent bodies to check their power, what's stopping more Aynaghars from emerging quietly in the future? Decentralization is another critical piece of the puzzle. Power concentrated in a few hands has often led to abuse, hasn't it? By distributing control, involving local governments and the general public in decision-making, we create systems that are accountable not just to an elite few but to everyone. It makes you wonder, a more participatory approach to governance, isn't that exactly what we need to rebuild trust? Now let me share some inspiration. Grassroots organizations in Bangladesh have been fighting for democratic values for years, often under unimaginable pressure. These groups, often working quietly, have pushed for everything from legal reform to public awareness campaigns. One story comes to mind: a group of young lawyers advocating for survivors of detention abuses. They've been documenting cases and filing petitions in court, and all of this while knowing the risks. Their bravery, well, it's incredible, isn't it? And then there are the communities themselves, the people who have refused to let fear silence them, parents who've spent decades searching for children who disappeared, activists who've continued to write, to speak out, even while knowing the cost. There's resilience in that, a strength that shows us what's possible in the face of repression. It's a reminder that even in times of darkness, people find ways to push back, to demand better. So if there's hope for Bangladesh, and I believe there is, it lies in these people, in the combination of systemic change and grassroots resilience. The road to justice and healing won't be easy, but step by step, reform by reform, it's a journey that can lead us towards something better. As we take a moment to reflect on everything we've explored in this episode, one thing becomes starkly clear. Bangladesh stands at a crossroads. This moment isn't just about confronting the dark legacy of Aynaghar or holding individuals accountable for past abuses. It's about asking ourselves, What kind of nation do we want to become? And more importantly, what steps do we need to take to get there? For many, the answer begins with ensuring that democracy isn't just a word we use, but a reality we live. A democracy without accountability, without justice, isn't sustainable, is it? The vision for a reformed Bangladesh revolves around creating institutions that are fair, transparent, and, most crucially, built to serve the people rather than control them. I recently spoke with a legal expert who's been advocating for judicial reforms in Bangladesh. They emphasize the need for modernizing outdated laws, many of which still reflect colonial-era governance. They said something that stuck with me. Justice should be blind, but it should never be out of reach. It's a simple idea, but it's profound, isn't it? When the system itself is skewed, where do ordinary people turn for justice? And then there are the survivors, the individuals who lived through the horrors of Aynaghar. Many of them are now stepping forward, sharing their stories in the hopes that those experiences might fuel systemic change. I heard from one survivor who said their greatest wish wasn't revenge, but reform. Justice for them isn't just about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what they did. It's remarkable, really, how hope can persist in even the bleakest circumstances. But this journey requires more than individual resilience. It takes collective effort, society rising together to demand better, and not just from the government, but from ourselves as citizens. It means fostering a culture of civic engagement, a willingness to participate in building a future grounded in honesty and inclusion. Because, let's face it, accountability doesn't start and end with institutions. It's a responsibility we all share. The international stage has a role to play here too, but as we've discussed, external allies can only amplify the voices we raise domestically. The real push for reform will come from within. It's in the grassroots movements, in the hands of young lawyers, fearless journalists, and activists who wake up every day ready to challenge the status quo. Change, as slow and as difficult as it might be, grows from this kind of persistence. And what about the role of compassion? It's easy to focus on policy, on laws and structures, but a reformed Bangladesh must also involve healing on a deeply human level. Truth commissions, reparations for victims, a deliberate effort to rebuild trust. That's where the real transformation can begin. It's about recognizing the humanity in those who were silenced, those who suffered, and those who resisted in the face of unimaginable repression. So where does this leave us? Bangladesh's journey toward justice is far from over. It will be challenging, messier than any idealists might hope, but also more promising than any cynics might think. Because every step, every reform, every story shared, it all builds toward a future where dark chapters like Aynaghar are not just acknowledged but remain as reminders of why we must never stop pushing for accountability. And on that note, we close this chapter not with finality, but with resolve. The work ahead is immense, but together, as a nation that refuses to let its shadows define its future, we can build something better. Until next time, I'm Farzana Mustafa. Let's keep the hope alive.